What if Prince William just confirmed that Princess Diana's death wasn't a tragic accident, but something far more sinister? At 41 years old, Prince William has finally broken decades of silence, admitting what millions have long suspected. His mother feared for her life, and her death may have been no accident at all. Tonight, we uncover the hidden warnings Diana left behind, the quiet investigations William carried out, and the chilling details that suggest her fate was sealed long before that fatal night in Paris. Stay with us, because once you hear what William has revealed, you'll never see Diana's story though. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. What if the royal family you thought you knew was hiding a dark, brutal secret, and two senior royals just blew it wide open? Tonight, Buckingham Palace is under siege not from outside enemies, but from within. Princess and King Charles have reportedly uncovered explosive evidence. Secret memos showing Queen Camilla allegedly ordered the destruction of files that detailed abuse by senior courtiers. This isn't just palace gossip. It's a cover-up that buried victims' cries for justice and could collapse the monarchy's public trust forever. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Stay with us, because ahead, we'll break down the shocking documents, reveal who tried to silence the victims, and why and Charles say they simply couldn't protect the lies any longer. What if the walls of Buckingham Palace, silent witnesses to centuries of history, could speak? What secrets would they reveal? Tonight, we are not dealing with rumors or whispers. We are dealing with something far more serious, allegations of a royal cover-up so damaging, even the most loyal members of the monarchy can no longer keep silent. Princess and King Charles, two of the most steadfast defenders of the institution, are now at the center of a growing scandal that threatens to tear apart the royal family's carefully maintained facade. In an extraordinary and unsettling twist, newly uncovered internal memos suggest that Queen Camilla herself ordered the destruction of documents detailing abuse allegations against senior courtiers. These were not anonymous rumors. These were formal complaints, real cries for justice, buried to protect reputations and preserve the monarchy's pristine image. And now, the truth is clawing its way to the surface. The phrase palace intrigue usually conjures images of minor power plays and family squabbles. But this is different. This is not a case of rivalry or gossip. This is a case involving the systemic silencing of victims and the possible obstruction of justice at the highest levels of one of the world's most powerful and scrutinized institutions. This is the kind of scandal that could reshape the monarchy's future and destroy public trust for generations to come. As we break this story open, you'll learn how Princess Anne, known for her no-nonsense approach and fierce loyalty to duty, became one of the key voices insisting that the cover-up could not continue. You'll discover how King Charles, torn between protecting the crown and confronting uncomfortable truths, finally sided with transparency, despite knowing the consequences could be devastating. And you'll see how Queen Camilla's alleged actions, once hidden beneath layers of royal privilege, have come to light in a way that cannot be ignored. This is a story about power, how it's used, how it's abused, and how sometimes the truth demands a reckoning even when it threatens everything you've spent a lifetime building. The monarchy has always operated on two levels, the visible and the invisible. The visible is what the public sees. The parades, the charity events, the carefully choreographed appearances. It's a well-rehearsed theater, designed to reinforce an image of stability, dignity, and tradition. The invisible is what happens behind the scenes, the real conversations, the real decisions, the real battles over image and influence. For decades, the royal family has relied on a simple strategy to survive scandals: deny, deflect, and wait. Public memory is short. Outrage fades. The news cycle moves on. But not this time. Not when the accusations involve the deliberate suppression of abuse complaints. Not when loyal members of the family themselves are sounding the alarm. According to multiple sources and leaked documents, the cover-up involved senior courtiers, trusted aides and officials who were supposed to serve not just the monarch, but the country. Allegations of emotional abuse, intimidation, and misconduct were reportedly filed against several high-ranking palace figures over the course of years. Instead of launching formal investigations, the complaints were allegedly buried. Victims were pressured to sign confidentiality agreements. Whistleblowers were sidelined. Files were quietly destroyed. And at the center of this alleged effort to contain the scandal, Queen Camilla. It's a name that carries heavy baggage. For years, Camilla has fought to rehabilitate her image, to move from being seen as the other woman in the Diana saga to a respected consort and eventual queen. It's a transformation many believed was complete. But if the allegations against her are true, that carefully rebuilt image could crumble in an instant. Because protecting abusers, even by omission, is a betrayal that the public may not forgive. Princess Anne's involvement in this story is crucial. Known as the hardest-working royal, and has spent her life avoiding scandal and focusing on her duties. She is widely respected for her independence, her straightforwardness, and her refusal to play media games. When Anne reportedly discovered the extent of the suppressed complaints and Camilla's alleged role, she is said to have been furious, and understood something that perhaps others in the royal family had forgotten. Credibility is the monarchy's currency. Once it is lost, it is almost impossible to regain. She knew that the only path forward, however painful, was to confront the truth head-on. No more cover-ups. No more protection of the institution at the expense of justice. If the monarchy was to survive this scandal, it would have to do so by facing its own failures. King Charles, for his part, found himself in an agonizing position. As king, his first duty is to the crown, to the survival of the institution. But as a father, brother, and husband, he is deeply connected to the individuals involved. Sources say Charles wrestled for weeks with the decision. He feared the damage that exposure would cause, not just to Camilla, but to the entire royal family. He worried about the blowback, the loss of public trust, the headlines that would brand the monarchy as corrupt and morally bankrupt. But in the end, he knew there was no choice. The world has changed. Secrecy, once the royal family's greatest weapon, is now its greatest vulnerability. In an age of leaks, whistleblowers, and relentless media scrutiny, the truth will always find a way out. Better, he reasoned, to be seen as the monarch who confronted injustice rather than the monarch who tried to hide it. What makes this story even more explosive is the timing. The monarchy is already facing intense scrutiny from younger generations who question its relevance and cost. Republican sentiment is on the rise. Every misstep, every scandal, adds fuel to the fire. And a scandal involving the deliberate suppression of abuse allegations is not just a misstep, it's a potential death blow. In the next few chapters, we'll take you deeper into this unfolding crisis. We'll reveal the contents of the internal memos that triggered Anne and Charles's alarm. We'll examine the culture inside the palace that allowed such abuses to occur and be hidden. We'll explore how Camilla's alleged actions fit into the larger pattern of royal crisis management, and why this time, the old strategies aren't working. We'll also hear from experts, legal analysts, historians, and palace insiders who will help us understand the stakes. Because make no mistake, this is not just a story about personal betrayal. This is a story about institutional failure. It is a story about what happens when the need to protect power outweighs the duty to protect people. And most importantly, this is a story about courage. About two senior royals, Anne and Charles, choosing to risk their reputations, their relationships, and perhaps even the future of the monarchy itself to confront an uncomfortable truth. As you watch this investigation unfold, ask yourself, how should powerful institutions be held accountable when they fail? How much should we demand from those who claim to serve us? And what happens to an institution when its own members no longer believe in its silence? The answers to those questions will not only shape the future of the royal family, they will shape the future of public trust in all institutions that wield great power behind closed doors. Tonight, the palace doors are cracking open, and what's spilling out is not the polished image of duty and tradition that the monarchy has carefully cultivated for centuries. It's something darker, something that demands our attention, our outrage, and our insistence on accountability. The story is no longer about protecting the crown. It's about protecting the truth. And the truth, once exposed, cannot be hidden again. Before the first memo surfaced, before the first whisper escaped the tightly guarded halls of Buckingham Palace, before Princess Anne and King Charles reached their breaking point, there was only silence. It was a silence built not out of ignorance, but out of fear. Fear of exposure. Fear of losing everything the royal family had worked centuries to preserve. Inside the palace, tension hung in the air like a storm cloud waiting to break. Every corridor, every grand room, every staff office carried with it an invisible weight. People spoke in hushed tones. Meetings were held behind closed doors, far from prying eyes and open windows. Trust, once a basic currency within the royal household, had become a scarce commodity. Everyone knew something was wrong. Very few dared to ask the questions that needed asking. for Princess, and the feeling was intolerable. She had always been known as one of the most no-nonsense members of the royal family. She wasn't interested in appearances for appearances' sake. She valued action over ceremony, duty over gossip. And what she saw happening behind the scenes disturbed her deeply. There were murmurs among staff, quiet, fragmented conversations about complaints that never seemed to be formally addressed. Rumors of mistreatment by senior courtiers. Stories of aides who had suddenly left their posts under suspicious circumstances, leaving behind only cryptic comments and sealed agreements. These were not isolated incidents. They formed a pattern, a troubling one. And Anne, with her instinct for spotting rot beneath polished surfaces, knew that the silence was not innocent. King Charles was not blind to the tension either. As sovereign, he received briefings on everything that happened within the palace. While many reports were sanitized, made to appear less severe than they truly were, Charles was experienced enough to read between the lines. He sensed the unease among his staff. He noticed the cautious glances exchanged during meetings. He understood that a hidden battle was taking place within his own household. What neither Anne nor Charles fully grasped at first was the scope of the problem. They suspected misconduct. They suspected negligence. They did not yet suspect an orchestrated cover-up reaching all the way to the top. The turning point came when a small group of palace staffers, disillusioned and frightened, decided they could no longer stay silent. They began to share information discreetly, passing it along in private conversations, encrypted emails, anonymous tips to journalists and activists. What they revealed was staggering: a series of internal complaints detailing patterns of emotional abuse, intimidation, and retaliation within the palace workforce. Complaints that had been officially filed, documented, and then made to disappear. These were not vague or speculative claims. They included dates, names, specific incidents. One young aide alleged she was subjected to sustained verbal abuse by a senior official, reduced to tears on an almost daily basis, and then pressured to sign a non-disclosure agreement when she tried to file a formal grievance. Another described being isolated, marginalized, and eventually forced out after raising concerns about workplace bullying. In every case, the result was the same: the victims were silenced, and the perpetrators were protected. Princess Anne became aware of these revelations not through official channels, but through her own network of trusted contacts within the palace, and was known for maintaining close relationships with the staff who worked directly with her, often preferring plain-spoken valets and aides over polished aristocrats. When whispers reached her ears, she listened carefully. She asked questions. She pieced together the fragments into a picture that was as infuriating as it was heartbreaking. Anne's reaction was swift and fierce. She demanded a private meeting with her brother. Not a formal meeting surrounded by advisors and PR officials, but a closed-door conversation where titles and hierarchy could be set aside. In that meeting, Anne laid out everything she had learned. She did not sugarcoat it. She made it clear: something rotten was festering inside their institution, and continuing to ignore it was not an option. King Charles listened in silence. Those close to him say he sat with his head bowed, absorbing every word. He asked questions, careful ones. He requested to see the memos himself, and promised to deliver what she could gather. There was no shouting in that meeting, no slammed fists or raised voices. Just two siblings, bound by blood and duty, facing the awful reality that their family's legacy was at risk. But tension inside the palace was not limited to Anne and Charles. Other members of the royal household began to feel the strain as well. Staffers divided into factions: those who believed in transparency and those who believed the institution must be protected at all costs. There were whispered accusations, subtle betrayals, information passed in secret to journalists and campaigners. At the heart of the tension was a chilling realization: the cover-up was not accidental. It was deliberate. And the orders to suppress the complaints, to destroy sensitive documents, did not come from low-ranking officials acting on their own. They came from the very highest levels of palace authority. Queen Camilla's alleged involvement sent shockwaves through the inner circle. For years, Camilla had carefully built her public image as a warm, approachable consort, dedicated to charity work and the modernization of the monarchy. The idea that she might have played a central role in protecting abusers and silencing victims felt like a betrayal of everything that image was supposed to represent. Inside the palace walls, fear gripped many who had previously felt untouchable. Senior courtiers who had dismissed the complaints as trivial now worried their names would be exposed. Communications officers scrambled to craft contingency plans, media strategies, potential scapegoats. Legal advisors reviewed confidentiality agreements, trying to assess how much risk the palace faced if former staffers chose to speak publicly. For Princess Anne and King Charles, the path forward was clear but treacherous. If they exposed the truth, they would risk triggering the biggest crisis the monarchy had faced in decades. If they stayed silent, they would become complicit in the very corruption they despised. And, true to her character, reportedly told her brother in no uncertain terms, "Better a short, painful scandal now than a slow, corrosive decay that would destroy the monarchy from within. Better to face the fire than to rot in the shadows." Charles agreed. But he also knew that exposing the cover-up would not be enough. They would need to show real accountability, real reform, if they hoped to salvage public trust. That meant investigations. That meant naming names. That meant consequences, not just for staffers, but possibly for members of the royal family themselves. The silent tension that had gripped the palace for so long was about to break. And when it did, it would not be a controlled release. It would be an explosion. As we move into the next chapter, we will uncover how the hidden memos finally came to light, who risked everything to expose them, and how the first cracks in the palace's wall of silence became impossible to ignore. Because once the truth began to seep out, there was no containing it. The palace had always been skilled at burying its secrets. Over the centuries, countless scandals, feuds, and failures had been quietly tucked away behind thick walls and thicker silence. But no matter how deeply you bury the truth, there is always someone who finds the courage or the desperation to dig it up. And this time, it was a handful of determined insiders who uncovered what the monarchy had worked so hard to conceal. The discovery of the hidden memos did not happen all at once. It was not a dramatic raid or a single whistleblower standing bravely against a tide of corruption. It was a slow, methodical unraveling, a gathering of whispers and documents, each piece small on its own, but together forming a damning picture. It began in the most ordinary way, with a mistake. An overworked, stressed-out junior official in the palace's Human Resources Department was tasked with clearing out archived files to make room for a digital transition. In the process of combing through dusty cabinets and forgotten folders, they stumbled upon a file labeled simply Internal Concerns. Curious, and assuming it was an outdated procedural manual, the official opened it and froze. Inside were pages of documented complaints. Real allegations, signed and detailed. Names, dates, incidents meticulously recorded. Some were years old. Some were more recent. But all carried the same disturbing theme: palace employees alleging mistreatment, intimidation, and emotional abuse at the hands of senior courtiers, and the systematic suppression of their complaints. Most chilling were the margins of some documents, bearing handwritten notes and instructions from higher-ups. Phrases like "handle quietly," "no public record," "remind of confidentiality agreement." Even more alarming was a memo explicitly instructing the destruction of specific complaint records, allegedly bearing Queen Camilla's initials. The junior official, realizing the gravity of what they had found, did not immediately report the discovery up the chain of command. Instead, they confided in a small circle of trusted colleagues. Those colleagues, in turn, reached out discreetly to figures they believed could be allies within the palace, people known for their integrity, for their willingness to put duty over personal loyalty. That network eventually led to Princess Anne's trusted aides. Anne's inner circle took no chances. They secured digital copies of the documents, preserving the originals in case they mysteriously vanished. Then they quietly arranged a meeting with Anne herself, presenting the findings in a locked, private room without the knowledge of the wider palace apparatus. Anne's reaction was immediate and fierce. She saw in those documents not just a breach of ethics, but a direct threat to the legitimacy of the royal family. If these memos ever became public, and there was no longer any doubt they would, the monarchy would face a reckoning the likes of which it had not seen since the abdication crisis of 1936. But Anne also recognized that they needed more. A single file, no matter how damning, could be dismissed as rogue or fabricated. To confront the full scale of the issue, they needed corroborating evidence. They needed witnesses. And they needed to trace the trail of orders that had led to the destruction of records. Thus began a second, more dangerous phase: quiet outreach to former staffers who had left the palace under suspicious circumstances. Contacting these individuals required extreme discretion. Some were bound by strict non-disclosure agreements. Others were fearful of retaliation, convinced that the palace's influence extended into every corner of British public life. But a few were willing to talk, off the record at first, then later, more openly as they realized they were not alone. Their stories matched the memos almost exactly. Accounts of verbal harassment, professional sabotage, emotional manipulation. Reports of being pressured into silence, of legal threats made under the guise of protecting institutional stability. Some recounted how complaints they filed disappeared without explanation, how follow-up meetings were canceled indefinitely, how they were quietly pushed out of their roles and replaced. The most damning testimony came from a mid-level staffer who had worked directly in the Human Resources Division. They confirmed that there had been an active directive to minimize internal complaints, to steer aggrieved employees toward amicable resolutions rather than formal investigations. And crucially, they alleged that Queen Camilla herself had taken a personal interest in at least one high-profile case, ordering that all related documentation be destroyed to avoid unnecessary embarrassment. As evidence mounted, and realized that this was no longer just an internal matter, the monarchy was sitting on a ticking bomb. So she turned once again to King Charles, this time armed not with rumors or second-hand accounts, but with hard proof. When Charles reviewed the expanded dossier, now including copies of memos, witness testimonies, and a detailed timeline of the cover-up, he understood immediately the magnitude of what they faced. There would be no easy way to contain it. There would be no clever press strategy to spin it away. And most painfully, there would be no way to shield Camilla without appearing complicit. The king called a private council, attended only by his most trusted advisors, Princess and a small legal team. For hours, they debated possible paths forward. Some suggested preemptively disclosing the scandal in a controlled manner, offering public apologies and promising reforms. Others urged complete silence, betting that public fatigue with royal drama would allow the story to die out, and was adamant, doing nothing would be suicide. Charles agreed. But agreeing on the need for action did not solve the deeper dilemma: how to preserve the monarchy while exposing a scandal that implicated its own leaders. How to tell the truth without tearing down the very institution they had sworn to protect. Meanwhile, the walls outside the council room were closing in. Rumors about the memos had already begun to leak. A handful of investigative journalists, known for their dogged pursuit of royal scandals, had caught wind of internal unrest within Buckingham Palace. They didn't yet have the full story, but they were digging, and it was only a matter of time before they found it. Inside the palace, tension soared. Some senior courtiers, aware that exposure was imminent, began lawyering up. Staffers who had previously been loyal to the institution above all else now scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. Whispers of betrayals, of strategic leaks, of last-minute attempts to cover tracks rippled through the palace corridors. It was a race against time: reveal the truth on their terms, or be dragged into the light by others. Princess, and never one for half measures, pushed for full transparency. A public admission, an apology, a commitment to reform. King Charles, after days of deliberation and soul-searching, agreed. There would be a reckoning, and it would begin with a royal acknowledgement that the palace had failed, not just its staff, but the public it claimed to serve. The discovery of the hidden memos marked the end of one era and the beginning of another. It shattered the illusion that the monarchy could operate indefinitely behind closed doors, protected by tradition and public goodwill. It forced even the most loyal members of the royal family to confront the uncomfortable reality that their beloved institution had, at times, valued image over justice. And as the next chapter of this story unfolds, we will see how the exposure of Camilla's alleged role rocked the royal family to its core, and why the decision to protect a few individuals at the expense of many could become the most devastating mistake the monarchy has made in modern times. Because once the documents were found, there was no more hiding. The reckoning had begun. For years, Queen Camilla had been a master of public reinvention. Once vilified as the woman who shattered the fairy tale image of Charles and Diana's marriage, she carefully rebuilt her reputation into one of loyalty, humor, and understated strength. She stayed out of overt scandal, avoided the spotlight whenever possible, and became, to many, a reassuring presence beside King Charles. But the discovery of the hidden memos painted a very different picture, one that threatened to erase decades of careful image crafting in a single, devastating blow. The allegations against Camilla were not vague. They were not abstract. They were concrete, tied to specific documents, direct orders, and multiple corroborating witness accounts. According to those sources, Camila did more than simply turn a blind eye to the abuse allegations lodged against senior palace courtiers. She allegedly played an active role in making sure those allegations never saw the light of day. The story begins with a series of complaints filed by palace staff over a span of several years. Some of the complaints involved verbal abuse, bullying, intimidation, and manipulation by powerful figures close to the royal household. The staffers who dared to raise their concerns believed that the palace's human resources apparatus would handle them professionally and confidentially. Instead, they found themselves isolated, discredited, and ultimately silenced. When the number of complaints grew too large to ignore, palace advisors escalated the issue to higher levels of authority. It was at that point, sources allege, that Camila personally intervened. According to internal memos and staff testimony, Camila issued a direct instruction. The complaints were to be contained, the implicated courtiers protected, and the reputational risk to the monarchy neutralized. The most damning piece of evidence was a memo bearing her initials, authorizing the secure disposal of sensitive documents related to a particularly high-profile complaint. The language used was deliberately vague, but the intent was clear: erase the paper trail, eliminate the risk. In private meetings with palace advisors, Camila reportedly argued that exposing the misconduct of senior courtiers would create a media firestorm that the monarchy could not afford. She feared that any scandal involving internal abuse allegations would give ammunition to Republican movements eager to abolish the monarchy entirely. She feared that the institution's centuries-old mystique would be irreparably damaged. In her mind, protecting the monarchy justified extraordinary measures. But the decisions made in those moments would come back to haunt her. Former staffers revealed that Camila's interventions created a chilling effect throughout the palace. Staff quickly learned that complaints would not be handled fairly, that speaking out would end careers, that loyalty to the institution was prized above personal well-being. It was an environment of fear and self-censorship, one where abuses could continue unchecked because everyone understood that the priority was always the same: protect the crown at all costs. Camila's defenders have argued that she acted out of a sense of duty, that her choices, however controversial, were made with the survival of the monarchy in mind. They insist that she was trying to shield the institution from a scandal that could have consumed it, that she believed internal reforms could be pursued quietly, without the need for public spectacle. But critics argue that whatever her motivations, the effect was the same. Victims were denied justice. Wrongdoing was concealed, and the monarchy's commitment to public service and moral leadership was fatally undermined. The allegations also revealed a more ruthless side of Camila that few outside the palace had ever seen. Behind the public smiles and supportive gestures, there was a shrewd operator who understood how to leverage influence, maneuver within palace politics, and enforce loyalty. She had learned from decades of surviving media attacks and public scorn that survival sometimes required hard, even merciless choices. Those choices, however, now placed her directly in the line of fire. The leak of the memos and the testimony surrounding them created a firestorm. Media outlets that had long treated Camila with gentle respect began asking hard questions. How much did she know about the abuse allegations? Why had she chosen to protect the accused rather than the accusers? What role did she see herself playing in a monarchy that claimed to be modern and accountable? Public trust, once slowly earned through years of careful image management, began to erode almost overnight. Inside the palace, the situation was even worse. Staffers who had once been fiercely loyal to Camila began to distance themselves. Some quietly resigned, unwilling to be associated with the emerging scandal. Others cooperated with investigations, providing further evidence of a systematic effort to suppress complaints. For King Charles, the revelations placed him in an impossible position. His wife stood accused of enabling a culture of silence and abuse. His sister, Princess, demanded accountability. His duty to the crown clashed violently with his personal loyalty to the woman who had stood by him through decades of personal and public turmoil. Sources inside the palace describe long, tense meetings between Charles and Camila, away from the public eye. Meetings filled not with shouting, but with painful, quiet reckonings. Camila insisted that she had acted to protect the monarchy. Charles did not dispute her motives, but he understood, perhaps better than anyone, that motives were irrelevant when public trust was lost. In the days following the leak, palace advisors considered multiple strategies to contain the damage. Some suggested issuing a statement emphasizing Camilla's service to the crown and her commitment to institutional stability. Others pushed for a limited apology, acknowledging failures in internal processes without directly admitting personal wrongdoing. But Princess Anne was uncompromising. She believed that only full transparency would suffice. She warned that anything less would be seen as more spin, more evasion, that the public would not forgive another whitewashed explanation. Camila herself, according to insiders, was torn. Part of her wanted to fight back, to defend her actions and frame them as necessary evils. But another part of her understood that the situation had spiraled beyond her control, that the damage to her reputation and to the monarchy's credibility could not be undone with clever words or careful PR. In the end, the palace opted for silence, at least initially. No public comment, no acknowledgement. The strategy was simple. Wait, watch, and hope that public attention would shift to the next scandal, the next outrage, the next distraction. But unlike past royal scandals, this one had deep roots. It wasn't just about personal failings. It was about systemic abuse. It was about victims who had been silenced, marginalized, betrayed. It was about an institution that, when faced with a choice between justice and self-preservation, chose itself. And in that context, Camilla's alleged involvement was not just a personal failure. It was a symbol of everything critics said was wrong with the monarchy: the secrecy, the arrogance, the belief that traditions and titles placed them above accountability. As the scandal continued to unfold, one thing became clear: whether Camilla stayed silent or spoke out, whether she defended her actions or apologized for them, the trust she had spent years rebuilding was shattered. And in a world where image is power, and power relies on public goodwill, that shattering carried consequences that could not be easily repaired. As we move into the next chapter, we will tell the stories of those who were silenced, the victims whose cries for help were buried under layers of royal protocol and self-interest. Their voices, once suppressed, are now rising. And with them comes a demand for answers the palace can no longer ignore. Because while Camilla's involvement revealed the machinery of suppression, it is the victims' stories that reveal the human cost. Beyond the marble halls and gilded ceilings, beyond the grand ceremonies and smiling photo ops, there were real people who worked for the palace, ordinary men and women who believed they were serving a noble cause. They dedicated their lives to the service of the crown, often for modest salaries and little recognition, driven by a sense of history, duty, and pride. But for some, the palace was not a sanctuary. It became a place of fear, humiliation, and betrayal. Their stories, long buried under the weight of royal secrecy, are now finally emerging. One of the earliest and most chilling accounts comes from a young woman named Abigail, whose name has been changed to protect her identity. Fresh out of university, Abigail had landed what she thought was her dream job, a junior administrative role within one of the royal households. The prestige of working for the royal family filled her with pride. But within months, that pride turned into dread. According to Abigail, her immediate superior, a senior courtier with decades of service, began subjecting her to relentless psychological abuse. He would belittle her in meetings, criticize her appearance, mock her background, and set impossible tasks designed to humiliate her when she inevitably failed. Attempts to seek help were met with veiled threats. When she finally found the courage to file a formal complaint, she was summoned to a private meeting where she was told, in no uncertain terms, that pursuing the matter would end her career in royal service. Faced with the impossible choice between her dignity and her future, Abigail eventually signed a non-disclosure agreement and left the palace in silence. She spent years battling anxiety and depression, haunted by the realization that the institution she had revered was willing to sacrifice her for its own protection. Her story is not unique. James, another former staff member, described a culture where favoritism and cruelty flourished unchecked. As a member of a logistics team responsible for royal events, he worked grueling hours under intense pressure. Mistakes, no matter how small, were met with explosive rage from his supervisor, a man so feared among the staff that junior aides took bets on how long new recruits would last before quitting. James filed a complaint after being physically shoved during a heated altercation. Instead of receiving support, he was transferred to a lesser role, isolated from his colleagues, and eventually encouraged to resign. Like Abigail, he signed a confidentiality agreement under pressure, convinced he had no other option. What these stories reveal is not just individual acts of cruelty, but a system designed to prioritize image over integrity. Staffers learned quickly that loyalty to the institution mattered more than truth. That speaking up meant exile. That protecting the royal brand was the ultimate, unspoken rule. One particularly harrowing case involved a woman named Priya, a diversity and inclusion officer brought into the palace as part of an initiative to modernize its internal culture. Priya was excited to bring fresh perspectives and reform to an ancient institution. Instead, she encountered immediate resistance and subtle but unmistakable racism from colleagues and superiors. Her ideas were dismissed as too woke. Her accent was mocked behind closed doors. She was repeatedly left out of key meetings and decision-making processes. When Priya raised concerns about her treatment, she found herself labeled difficult and uncooperative. Her contract was not renewed, and she left feeling not just professionally betrayed, but personally degraded. Priya's case is especially significant because it highlights the hypocrisy at the heart of the palace's public messaging. Outwardly, the monarchy has championed diversity and inclusion, holding grand events and issuing public statements. But internally, as Priya's experience shows, those commitments often ring hollow. Other victims include junior chefs, gardeners, personal assistants, communications officers, all people whose work kept the palace running smoothly, whose faces rarely, if ever, appeared in glossy magazines. Their experiences tell the same story. A culture where abuse was normalized, where loyalty was demanded but not reciprocated, where victims were seen as liabilities to be managed, not people to be protected. For many, the betrayal was compounded by the realization that the very individuals who could have intervened, senior royals, trusted advisors, either turned a blind eye or actively participated in the cover-up. They were sacrificed not for the greater good, but for the comfort and convenience of those at the top. When the hidden memos surfaced, these victims were faced with a difficult choice. Speaking out meant risking legal action, public scrutiny, and personal pain. But staying silent meant continuing to enable the system that had betrayed them. Some chose to come forward, giving anonymous testimony to journalists and investigators. Others, still bound by fear and legal agreements, supported the movement quietly from the shadows. Their bravery in telling their stories has forced a reckoning. It is easy to criticize institutions in the abstract. It is harder to hear the human cost, the lost careers, the shattered self-esteem, the lingering trauma. These are not nameless, faceless statistics. They are real people who believed in the ideals the monarchy claimed to embody, only to find themselves abandoned when they needed protection the most. The palace's response to these emerging stories has been muted at best. Official statements have emphasized ongoing internal reviews and commitment to best practices, vague language that does little to address the scale of the betrayal. Critics argue that without transparency, accountability, and real structural change, the monarchy's promises are meaningless. Meanwhile, the victims continue to wait for justice, for acknowledgement, for the simple decency of being heard. Meanwhile, the victims continue to wait for justice, for acknowledgement, for the simple decency of being heard. The human side of this scandal cannot be overstated. Institutions like the monarchy derive their legitimacy from public trust. That trust is not built solely on grandeur or tradition. It is built on the belief that those in power will act with integrity and humanity. When that belief is shattered, it is not just individuals who suffer. It is the entire foundation of the institution itself. As the investigation into the palace cover-up deepens, the voices of these victims grow louder. They demand not just apologies, but concrete actions, independent investigations, public acknowledgement of wrongdoing, real consequences for those who abuse their power. Some call for reforms to the internal structure of the royal household, including better protections for staff, clearer channels for reporting misconduct, and independent oversight to ensure accountability. Others go further, questioning whether an institution so steeped in secrecy and hierarchy can ever truly reform itself. Regardless of the outcome, the victims have already changed the narrative. No longer can the palace hide behind tradition and ceremony to shield itself from scrutiny. No longer can it dismiss allegations as the grievances of disgruntled employees. The human cost is too great, too visible. As we move into the next chapter, we will examine the inner circle of palace courtiers, the powerful insiders who benefited from the culture of silence, and how they were protected while others were sacrificed. Because to understand the full depth of this scandal, we must not only hear the voices of the victims, we must also expose the machinery that enabled their suffering to continue unchecked. In every institution where misconduct festers, there are gatekeepers who ensure that the guilty remain protected. The palace was no exception. If anything, the royal household, with its centuries-old obsession with secrecy and hierarchy, created a system even more adept at shielding its insiders. The discovery of the hidden memos and the victims' testimonies revealed that the real scandal was not just the abuse itself. It was the deliberate, coordinated effort to protect the courtiers responsible. The courtiers in question were not fringe figures. They were deeply embedded within the structure of royal life: senior advisors, private secretaries, heads of communications, and trusted personal aides. Their roles were indispensable. They shaped the monarchy's public image, managed day-to-day operations, advised on political and diplomatic matters, and coordinated sensitive family affairs. In many ways, they were the monarchy's invisible architects, working behind the scenes to maintain the institution's power and prestige. With power came protection. When complaints arose against these figures, they were not treated as isolated incidents demanding investigation. They were treated as threats to the institution. Threats to be neutralized swiftly and quietly. The rationale was simple but devastating. To expose a senior courtier would be to expose the palace itself to scandal. Better to suppress the complaint, protect the insider, and preserve the illusion of impeccable service to the crown. Internal documents and testimony revealed a clear pattern. When a staffer filed a complaint, it was first reviewed by immediate superiors, not independent investigators. These superiors, often close allies of the accused, would recommend informal resolution wherever possible. In practice, this meant pressuring the complainant to withdraw their allegations in exchange for assurances of future support or small career advancements. If the staffer persisted, more coercive tactics were employed. Some were warned of reputational ruin, blacklisting within the civil service, or even legal action for breach of confidentiality. In several documented cases, non-disclosure agreements were presented under the guise of standard HR procedures, effectively silencing victims permanently. The courtiers who benefited from this system were keenly aware of their protected status. They operated with a sense of impunity, emboldened by the knowledge that the palace's top priority was to shield itself, not to protect its employees. Some wielded their power openly, using their proximity to senior royals as a shield against consequences. Others were more subtle, cultivating networks of loyalty among staff, ensuring that any complaint would be met with a chorus of denials from carefully positioned allies. The culture of protection extended all the way up to senior royals. Several reports indicated that when concerns about a particularly influential courtier were raised, palace advisors would brief the royal they served, only to be met with a firm directive to handle it internally and avoid public scandal at all costs. This was not mere negligence. It was an active decision to prioritize personal loyalty and institutional reputation over justice. Queen Camilla's alleged involvement in suppressing complaints was emblematic of this culture. But she was not the only one who participated in, or at least tolerated, the machinery of protection. The system was bigger than any single individual. It was embedded in the very way the palace operated. For example, the palace communications office played a crucial role in managing perceptions. When rumors of staff unrest occasionally leaked to the press, they were swiftly countered with narratives emphasizing the honor and privilege of working for the royal family. Anonymous sources would paint complainants as disgruntled or unsuitable for the demands of royal service. These stories, carefully fed to friendly journalists, ensured that public sympathy remained firmly with the palace. Behind closed doors, the same communications teams coordinated media blackouts, ensuring that more serious allegations never saw the light of day. Editors of major British newspapers, some of whom maintained close relationships with palace insiders, were discreetly warned that pursuing such stories could endanger their future access to royal coverage. This strategy worked for years. It allowed the palace to maintain its image of unassailable dignity, even as internal rot festered unchecked. But power breeds complacency, and complacency breeds mistakes. One such mistake was underestimating the growing cultural shift happening beyond the palace gates. In a post-Me Too world, public tolerance for institutional cover-ups had plummeted. Whistleblowers were no longer dismissed as troublemakers. They were celebrated as truth-tellers. Social media amplified their voices, bypassing traditional gatekeepers. Investigative journalism regained its teeth. When the hidden memos emerged and when victims began sharing their stories, the palace found itself facing a world it no longer fully controlled. The old strategies, denial, deflection, silence, no longer sufficed. The protection once afforded to the courtiers began to crumble. Some of the most powerful figures within the palace quickly recognized the shift. Lawyers were retained. Carefully worded statements were drafted, preparing for potential inquiries. Some senior staff quietly resigned, hoping to escape the storm before it reached full fury. Others clung to their positions, gambling that their proximity to the crown would still shield them. For King Charles and Princess Anne, the challenge was profound. Exposing the misconduct risked triggering a domino effect, implicating a wider network of insiders. Protecting them, on the other hand, would only deepen the crisis when the full truth inevitably surfaced. Their decision was clear: the protection racket had to end. Plans were set in motion to overhaul the palace's internal structure. Independent investigators were brought in, a move unprecedented in royal history. The hiring of outside legal experts signaled a shift from damage control to genuine accountability. Leaked documents suggested that a list of senior courtiers under investigation had been compiled, with outcomes ranging from forced resignations to potential criminal referrals. Still, the damage was done. The palace's long-standing culture of protecting its own, no matter the cost, had been laid bare. Public trust, once eroded slowly over decades, now hemorrhaged with alarming speed. Even among royalists, there was a growing sense of betrayal. Not because individuals had failed, but because the institution itself had chosen to sacrifice justice on the altar of self-preservation. The courtiers who once strutted through palace halls with impunity now did so with caution, aware that the ground beneath them was no longer secure. Whispered alliances fractured. Long-held secrets teetered on the edge of exposure. The age of invincibility was over. What remains is a fundamental question. Can an institution built on hierarchy, secrecy, and unaccountable power truly reform itself? Or is this scandal merely the beginning of a deeper reckoning, one that will force the monarchy to confront not just individual misconduct, but the very system that allowed it to thrive? As we move into the next chapter, we will explore Princess Anne's breaking point. The moment when her patience snapped, when her loyalty to truth outweighed her loyalty to tradition, and when she became the unlikely catalyst for one of the most dramatic royal reckonings in modern history. Because sometimes, even within the oldest and most revered institutions, it takes just one person refusing to stay silent to bring the walls crashing down. Princess Anne's breaking point. For decades, Princess Anne had been the monarchy's anchor. Unfazed by media storms, untempted by fame, and had built her reputation on relentless hard work, stoicism, and devotion to duty. She had navigated scandal, family drama, and shifting public opinion without once appearing to falter. But even the steadiest among us have limits. Behind Anne's famously guarded expression, a quiet fury had been building for months. When the cover-up was fully exposed, when the victims' stories became undeniable, Princess Anne hit her breaking point. The process was gradual at first, and began by asking quiet questions behind closed doors. She requested to see internal HR files, asked aides off the record about staff turnover rates, held discreet conversations with former employees she trusted. What she heard disturbed her deeply. Patterns of complaints ignored, grievances buried, promising young staffers driven out under suspicious circumstances. It was clear that this was not a case of isolated incidents, but a culture that protected power at all costs, and was known for her bluntness. But even she initially tried to handle the situation internally. She approached key figures within the palace, raising her concerns in private meetings. She warned that the monarchy's moral authority, the very thing that justified its continued existence, was eroding from within. She urged for immediate reforms, independent investigations, public acknowledgments of past failings, a complete restructuring of how staff grievances were handled. She was met with stonewalling. Senior courtiers reassured her that the situation was under control. They spoke of internal reviews, updated HR protocols, and a commitment to continuous improvement. But behind the polished words, and sensed a deeper truth, they were more concerned with managing the optics than fixing the system. The final straw came when Anne discovered the extent of Queen Camilla's alleged involvement. The evidence was undeniable. Orders to destroy records. Direct interference in the grievance process. Not second-hand rumors, but documented proof. For Anne, this was a betrayal not just of palace staff, but of the very principles the monarchy was supposed to uphold. And confronted her brother, King Charles, in one of the most emotionally charged conversations of their lives. Witnesses described the meeting as tense, with Anne laying out the facts with her characteristic bluntness. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Every word she spoke carried the weight of unassailable moral authority. Charles listened, but could tell he was torn. Loyalty to his wife. Fear of scandal. Fear of weakening the monarchy at a time when it already faced existential threats from shifting public attitudes. And understood his hesitation, but she could not accept inaction. Her message was simple. If they did not confront this head-on, if they allowed the culture of protection and secrecy to continue, they would lose everything. Not just public trust, but their right to lead. The monarchy's survival depended not on hiding its flaws, but on proving it could hold itself to the highest standards, even when it hurt. Anne's breaking point was not about anger. It was about principle. She had spent her entire life serving an institution she believed in. To watch it betray its own ideals in the name of self-preservation was more than she could bear. Following that meeting, Anne began to take concrete steps. She refused to participate in public events that required her to stand shoulder to shoulder with senior courtiers implicated in the scandal. She began briefing her own trusted advisors to prepare for the possibility of a full public reckoning. And crucially, she pushed Charles to authorize an independent external investigation, something unprecedented in royal history, and also reached out discreetly to some of the victims. Through intermediaries, she sent messages of support, signaling that their voices had been heard. It was a risky move. Had it become public at the time, it would have sparked an even greater media frenzy. But it understood that moral leadership sometimes meant breaking with tradition. Her stance caused fractures within the royal household. Some senior figures viewed her actions as dangerous, accusing her of disloyalty. They warned Charles that Anne's insistence on transparency could irreparably damage the monarchy. But Anne didn't care. She knew that the real danger came not from exposure but from continuing to prioritize reputation over integrity. In private conversations with her closest friends, Anne reportedly expressed deep sadness over what the palace had become. She spoke of the ideal of service, of the duty to protect not just the monarchy's image but its soul. She lamented that somewhere along the way, those values had been lost beneath layers of bureaucracy, privilege, and fear. Anne's breaking point also marked a shift in public perception. As rumors of her behind-the-scenes efforts began to leak to the press, public admiration for her grew. She was seen not as a rebel but as a voice of conscience within an increasingly tarnished institution. She embodied the principle that real leadership means doing the right thing even when it is difficult, even when it comes at a personal cost. Her actions forced King Charles to confront realities he had tried to avoid. The pressure from Anne, combined with growing media scrutiny and public outrage, made it impossible to continue the old strategy of denial and silence. If the monarchy was to survive this storm, it would have to change, and that change had to start at the top. Anne's role in this crisis cannot be overstated. She was the catalyst that turned private concern into public action. She was the moral compass that prevented the palace from sinking deeper into self-preservation and denial. She reminded everyone, within the royal household and beyond, that institutions only deserve respect when they earn it through their actions, not just their history. As the scandal continued to unfold, and remained steadfast, she knew the battle was far from over. There would be more revelations, more painful reckonings, more difficult choices ahead. But she also knew that without truth, there could be no trust. And without trust, there could be no monarchy. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore King Charles's inner conflict, the agonizing choices he faced between protecting his family and fulfilling his duty, and how he ultimately came to realize that personal loyalty must sometimes be sacrificed for the greater good. Because in the end, even kings must answer to something greater than themselves. Every monarch faces moments of personal agony, moments where the responsibilities of the crown collide violently with the instincts of the heart. For King Charles, the palace cover-up scandal triggered the greatest internal conflict of his reign. He was no longer just a man, a husband, a brother. He was a king. And kings, as history proves again and again, do not have the luxury of personal loyalty when duty calls. In private, Charles was torn to pieces. Those close to him describe a man racked by guilt, anger, and sorrow. His entire life had been spent preparing for the crown, shadowed by the example of his mother, Queen Elizabeth II, who embodied duty above all else. But now that the crown sat on his own head, Charles found himself facing a decision she had never had to make: how to deal with the disgrace of his own household, knowing that in doing so, he might destroy the woman who had stood by him for half a lifetime. Camila was more than his wife. She was his confidant, his anchor during decades of public scorn and personal turmoil. She had endured relentless attacks from the media, disapproval from the public, and icy hostility within royal circles. Through it all, she had remained steadfast at his side. To turn against her now felt like an act of betrayal so profound it nearly broke him. And yet the evidence was clear. The memos, the testimonies, the whispered confirmations from staffers who had once sworn loyalty to the royal household. It was no longer possible to dismiss the allegations as exaggerations or misunderstandings. Camila had played a direct role in suppressing the complaints. She had prioritized the institution's image over the well-being of its people. Charles struggled to reconcile two competing realities: the private loyalty he owed to Camila and the public duty he owed to the crown. As a husband, his instinct was to defend, to protect, to shield. As a king, his obligation was to truth, to justice, and to the people he served. For weeks, Charles delayed making any decisive move. Advisors noted his increasing withdrawal, his growing frustration with even minor issues. He became irritable in meetings, short-tempered with aides, and uncharacteristically silent during public engagements. The pressure was crushing him, weighing heavier than the crown itself. He turned to a few trusted confidants, seeking counsel. Some, understanding his emotional attachment, urged caution. They argued that exposing Camila would irreparably fracture the royal family, that it would hand ammunition to Republicans eager to dismantle the monarchy. They warned that once the dam of public outrage burst, it could not be controlled, that even a full confession might not be enough to save the institution. Others, notably Princess and a small circle of reform-minded advisors, argued the opposite. They insisted that the monarchy's strength lay not in its ability to avoid scandal, but in its willingness to confront it. They reminded Charles that public trust, once lost, could never be fully regained through silence. They pointed out that if the royal family was seen as complicit in protecting abusers, it would lose its moral authority completely. In the end, the decision came down to a single, devastating realization. Charles understood that his personal pain, his loyalty to Camila, his fear of scandal, all of it was irrelevant when weighed against the future of the monarchy. The crown was not his possession. It was a trust, handed down through generations, to be preserved for the future. And trust, once broken, could not be repaired with tradition alone. He also understood that if he failed to act, others would act for him. The media would not let the story die. The public would demand accountability. Parliament, under pressure from an angry electorate, could even be forced to intervene. The monarchy itself could be dragged, unwilling and unprepared, into a confrontation it might not survive. King Charles knew he had to move first, before the choice was taken from him. The conflict within him was visible in the days leading up to his decision. He appeared gaunt, haggard. Observers noted how his usual warmth seemed replaced by a cold, mechanical focus. He delegated more duties to Prince William and Princess, and signaling a shift toward a more aggressive crisis management approach. Privately, Charles confronted Camila. The meeting was, by all accounts, one of the most painful experiences of his life. Sources say he did not accuse her with anger but with sorrow. He laid out the evidence, explained the gravity of the situation, and made it clear that a reckoning was inevitable. Camila reportedly defended her actions at first, insisting she had acted to protect the monarchy from scandal, not to harm individuals. She pleaded that the monarchy's survival had been her sole motivation. Charles listened, but he had already made his decision. He informed Camila that an independent investigation would proceed, that internal reforms would be announced, that if necessary, those implicated, including herself, would have to face consequences, both legal and reputational. There would be no private shielding, no quiet reassignment, no further destruction of evidence. It was a decision that gutted him personally, but one he knew was essential. The private fallout was immediate. Camila withdrew from public engagements citing health concerns. Courtiers close to her resigned or were reassigned. Legal advisors prepared for possible inquiries. Inside Buckingham Palace, a new mood of grim resignation took hold. The old ways of handling scandal, deny, deflect, silence, were over. Charles also knew that this was only the beginning. The path ahead would be brutal. There would be weeks, perhaps months, of damaging headlines. There would be calls for his abdication. There would be those who saw even his decisive action as too little, too late. He would face accusations of weakness, of complicity, of moral failure. But he also knew that by confronting the truth, by making the hard choice to prioritize duty over personal loyalty, he was giving the monarchy its best chance at survival. It was a brutal lesson in leadership, A reminder that kingship is not about personal comfort or family loyalty. It is about the willingness to sacrifice even what you hold most dear for the sake of something greater. As Charles prepared to make a public statement acknowledging the scandal and outlining the palace's plan for reform, he understood that his reign would be defined by this moment. Not by ceremonies or pageantry, but by his response to a crisis that struck at the very heart of the institution. In the next chapter, we will explore the delicate dance between public relations and private reality, how the palace attempted to spin the crisis, how the public reacted, and why the traditional royal playbook was no longer enough to contain the growing fury. Because in the modern world, survival depends not just on facing the truth, but on doing it before it crushes you completely. For as long as it had existed, the British monarchy had relied on a powerful illusion, the illusion that it was infallible, controlled, dignified, above the noise of politics and scandal. But in the modern world, where information travels faster than tradition, illusions crack quickly under the weight of truth. As the palace abuse cover-up exploded into public view, the royal household found itself scrambling to manage two competing realities: the story they wanted the world to believe and the story that was actually unfolding behind closed doors. The first instinct inside the palace was the same as it had been during countless past scandals: manage the message. Crisis communications specialists were brought in. Meetings were held late into the night, with advisors discussing wording, timing, and damage control strategies. The goal was clear: limit the fallout. Control the headlines. Protect what could be protected. A small team drafted a statement meant to address the allegations without admitting guilt. It spoke of the monarchy's long-standing commitment to the highest standards of employment practice and promised an independent review of workplace culture. It acknowledged the concerns raised by staffers with deep seriousness, but stopped short of admitting any wrongdoing by specific individuals. Behind the scenes, however, the reality was far grimmer. Staff morale was in free fall. Former employees who had signed confidentiality agreements were contacting journalists, emboldened by the rising public outrage. Legal teams were flooded with inquiries and document requests. A handful of members from the royal household even considered whistleblowing to regulatory authorities, fearing personal liability if the scandal deepened into criminal proceedings. Within the senior ranks of the royal family, unity shattered further. Some, like Princess Anne, continued to push for a full, public reckoning. Others worried about the long-term survival of the institution and wanted the story to be managed quietly, slowly buried under an avalanche of other news stories. Lines were drawn. Tensions rose. The traditional palace PR approach relied on an old formula: brief sympathetic reporters behind the scenes, provide a few exclusive tidbits to trusted newspapers in exchange for favorable coverage, and count on the media's reliance on royal access to keep them from digging too deeply. But the formula was broken. This time, the media smelled blood, and they were not about to be managed. In fact, for many journalists, the palace's initial statement only fueled further investigation. The vagueness, the lack of concrete commitments, the tone of carefully crafted neutrality, it was all seen as evidence that the monarchy still didn't grasp the seriousness of the situation. Editorials began to appear in major newspapers, questioning the moral authority of the institution. High-profile commentators who had once defended the monarchy started to distance themselves. Social media, always a volatile force, erupted in fury. Hashtags calling for transparency, justice for palace staff, and even calls to abolish the monarchy trended globally. In public appearances, senior royals tried to maintain a facade of calm, smiling at engagements, shaking hands, cutting ribbons. But the tension was visible. The forced smiles, the clipped tones in interviews, the increasingly aggressive security measures to shield them from shouting protesters who began appearing outside royal events. King Charles, in particular, seemed burdened by the knowledge that every step he took, every word he said, was being dissected not as a celebration of monarchy, but as a reminder of its failures. The palace's PR team attempted more aggressive strategies as the days wore on. They floated stories about the royal family's charitable work. They emphasized their contributions to mental health initiatives and diversity programs. They highlighted the Queen's Platinum Jubilee celebrations, hoping that public nostalgia might blunt the anger. It didn't work. The public was no longer interested in photo ops or ceremonial speeches. They wanted answers. They wanted accountability. They wanted to know how many complaints had been buried, how many careers had been destroyed, how many victims had suffered in silence while the palace preserved its image. Attempts to redirect the conversation only made the palace seem more out of touch, more defensive. It fed a growing narrative that the monarchy, an institution that prided itself on service, was now primarily concerned with self-preservation. Behind the scenes, the stress was immense. Insiders described a workplace on the verge of collapse. Long-serving courtiers retired early. Mid-level staffers updated their resumes and discreetly contacted recruitment agencies. Senior advisors spent more time coordinating legal strategies than planning state visits. There was no escape. Every newspaper stand, every television news broadcast, every trending topic online was a reminder that the palace could no longer control the narrative. They could no longer hide behind centuries of deference. They were just another powerful institution caught trying to shield itself from the consequences of its own failures. In moments of honesty, some within the palace admitted the reality. This scandal had fundamentally changed the way the public viewed the monarchy. The old mystique was gone. In its place was a hard, demanding gaze that expected answers, not platitudes. Yet there were also those who saw a path forward, narrow and painful as it might be. Some advisors pushed for radical transparency. Full public disclosure of all complaints, a complete overhaul of palace employment practices, independent oversight. They argued that only by tearing down the old walls and letting the sunlight in could the monarchy hope to rebuild public trust. King Charles, influenced heavily by Anne's unyielding stance, began to lean toward this approach. He understood that survival required sacrifice not just of individuals, but of old habits, old strategies, old ways of thinking. He commissioned an external firm to conduct a full audit of palace HR practices, with the promise that the findings would be made public. He authorized the establishment of a new, independent ombudsman role within the royal household, tasked with investigating future complaints free from internal influence. And he prepared a second, more detailed public statement that acknowledged the failures more explicitly. Privately, he also made it clear that no one, including members of the royal family, would be exempt from scrutiny. If evidence emerged that implicated senior figures, they would be held accountable. It was a start, a painful, belated start. But it was a recognition that the old palace, the palace of whispers and cover-ups, could not survive in the modern world. The path ahead remained perilous. Public skepticism was deep and justified. Trust would not be rebuilt overnight. Every future mistake, every perceived lapse, would be judged harshly. But at least the palace was moving forward, however slowly, however imperfectly. The era of managing scandals behind closed doors was over. As we move into the next chapter, we will explore the tipping point, the moment when the palace could no longer keep the truth contained, when the hidden documents were leaked to the public, and when the full, unfiltered reality shattered what little control the monarchy still held over the narrative. Because in the end, truth, once unleashed, answers to no crown. The final days of Princess Diana's life were not those of a woman at peace. They were shadowed by a growing sense of fear, isolation, and unease. Far from the public smiles and glamorous photo ops, Diana lived her last weeks under the constant pressure of unseen forces closing in. When we revisit this period with fresh eyes, informed by Prince William's recent admission, the picture becomes even darker and more disturbing. By the summer of 1997, Diana was both more free and more vulnerable than ever. She was no longer officially part of the royal family, having finalized her divorce from Prince Charles the year before.